March 23, 1945. The time was precisely 10:47 in the morning. Inside a British command aircraft descending toward Germany, Winston Churchill sat in silence. The low hum of engines filled the cabin as the aircraft moved steadily toward its destination. Churchill was not traveling merely as an observer. He was arriving to witness what he believed would be a defining moment for British military prestige. Below him, along the banks of the Rhine River, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Plunder was about to begin. It was the largest and most meticulously prepared river-crossing operation of the entire European war. Months of planning had gone into this moment, and every element was designed to demonstrate one central truth: Britain remained the professional backbone of the Allied coalition. Operation Plunder was not simply a tactical maneuver. It was a statement. Montgomery had insisted on overwhelming force, careful coordination, and complete control. Thousands of artillery guns had been positioned with mathematical precision. Airborne units were standing by, ready to drop at carefully selected locations. Smoke generators had been tested repeatedly to ensure enemy positions would be blinded at the critical moment. Engineers had rehearsed bridge construction again and again, timing every movement down to the minute. Churchill had ensured that the world would be watching. War correspondents had been invited to the front. Photographers were already in place. Even the official communiqué praising British military excellence had been written in advance, ready to be released the moment Montgomery's forces secured the eastern bank of the Rhine. Everything had been prepared to shape the narrative of Allied victory. This crossing was meant to remind both allies and enemies that Britain still mattered. Then the radio crackled. The message that followed was brief, only 4 words, but they struck Churchill with the force of a physical blow. Patton crossed last night. Not today, not during Operation Plunder, not alongside Montgomery's massive artillery barrage and airborne landings, but the night before, quietly, unexpectedly, without permission. George Patton had crossed the Rhine using small assault boats and a limited force of determined soldiers. There had been no grand buildup, no extended artillery preparation, no carefully staged spectacle. It was fast, improvised, and risky. Later, Patton would describe the men involved as a group of angry soldiers who were tired of waiting. For Churchill, the implications were immediate and severe. Almost at once, Montgomery's response arrived. It was formal, sharp, and uncompromising. He accused the Americans of insubordination and declared that Allied planning had been undermined. Patton's action, Montgomery wrote, had made a mockery of coalition strategy. His demand was explicit and absolute. Patton must be relieved of command immediately. Churchill understood instantly that this was not simply a disagreement between two generals. This was a crisis that struck at the heart of the Allied partnership. What he chose to say next would determine not only Patton's fate, but Britain's standing within the alliance. To understand the impossible position Churchill found himself in, one must go back to January 12, 1945. On that day, Churchill had personally assured Montgomery that Operation Plunder would be the centerpiece of Allied victory in Europe. It would not be another American improvisation. It would be a British-led operation showcasing discipline, planning, and professionalism. Montgomery accepted this assurance as a personal promise. He committed himself completely to fulfilling it. For nearly 2 months, Montgomery prepared obsessively. More than 1 million men were allocated to the operation. Tens of thousands of vehicles were assembled and positioned. Thousands of artillery pieces were coordinated across multiple formations. Airborne drops were planned in detail. Smoke screens were rehearsed repeatedly. It would be the largest river crossing since Normandy, executed with precision and control. Churchill believed this operation would restore Britain's stature. For much of the war, American forces had moved faster, pushed deeper, and captured headlines. Operation Plunder was meant to remind the world that British command and planning still set the standard. Then Patton acted. On March 22 at 10:37 p.m., Patton called Dwight Eisenhower from Luxembourg. The tone of the call was casual, almost dismissive. He reported that his forces had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. Assault boats had been used. Casualties were minimal. The bridgehead was secure. Eisenhower immediately grasped the scale of the problem. He asked whether Montgomery had been informed. Patton replied that Montgomery had his own crossing scheduled and that he had not wanted to distract him with details. The call ended. Eisenhower turned to his staff and spoke plainly. Patton had just created the largest diplomatic crisis of the war. By the early hours of March 23, confirmation reached Montgomery's headquarters. American forces had crossed the Rhine nearly 12 hours before Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin. Those present later described Montgomery's reaction as controlled but icy. There was no shouting, no outward rage. Instead, there was certainty. Patton, Montgomery declared, had deliberately undermined Allied strategy to satisfy his own ego. This was not initiative. It was insubordination at the strategic level. He demanded that Patton be relieved of command, court-martialed, and sent home immediately. His chief of staff attempted to intervene, nodding that the crossing had been successful and that the American Third Army was rapidly expanding its bridgehead. Montgomery cut him off. Success, he insisted, was irrelevant. Discipline was paramount. Without discipline, alliances collapsed into chaos. Montgomery drafted an urgent message to Churchill. An American general had conducted an unauthorized operation, violating agreed strategic frameworks. Churchill was asked to demand that Eisenhower remove Patton at once. British forces, Montgomery argued, could not operate alongside commanders who ignored command authority. Churchill received the message at 9:15 in the morning, minutes before his aircraft was scheduled to land. His military secretary later recalled watching him read it multiple times. The facts were clear. Patton had crossed at Oppenheim. Casualties were low. The bridgehead was secure, and he had done it without permission from anyone. Churchill stared out of the aircraft window at the German landscape below, fully aware that the decision he was about to make would reshape the balance of the alliance. Churchill remained silent as the aircraft continued its descent. Montgomery was his chosen general, his protege, and the embodiment of everything Churchill believed proper British military conduct represented. Careful preparation, discipline, control. Yet Patton had crossed Hitler's last major natural defensive barrier before Montgomery's operation had even begun. The political calculation was brutal. If Churchill supported Montgomery, he would be demanding the firing of an American general for succeeding too quickly. If he supported Patton, he would be undercutting British military prestige in full view of the world. The aircraft landed at 10:52 a.m. Montgomery was waiting on the tarmac, standing rigidly, posture perfect, face unreadable. He saluted Churchill formally and thanked him for coming to witness Operation Plunder. Churchill responded with careful neutrality, acknowledging the message he had received and asking Montgomery to walk with him away from the assembled staff. Montgomery began immediately. He insisted Patton be relieved of command. His insubordination, he said, could not be tolerated under any circumstances. Churchill raised his hand, stopping him. He asked Montgomery a single question. If Patton had requested permission to cross the Rhine the previous night, what would Montgomery have said? Montgomery did not hesitate. He would have denied the request. The crossing diverted attention from the agreed main effort of the Allied plan. Churchill pressed further. Was this truly about strategy, or was it about pride? Montgomery replied that it was about maintaining command discipline. Without discipline, he argued, the coalition would fall apart. Churchill's response was quiet but devastating. He said the real issue was that Patton had made Montgomery look slow. The words hung in the cold German air. Churchill reminded Montgomery that he had defended British methods for years. Careful preparation, overwhelming force, and minimal casualties had saved countless lives. But watching Patton cross the Rhine with boats while Montgomery required months of preparation forced uncomfortable questions. Montgomery objected sharply, accusing Churchill of suggesting that American methods were superior. Churchill clarified it was not American methods, it was American speed. The war, Churchill said, was entering its final phase. Germany was collapsing. Every day spent preparing allowed Soviet forces to advance further west. Patton understood this urgency. He moved before opportunity disappeared. Montgomery accused Churchill of choosing Patton over him. Churchill denied it. He was choosing to end the war quickly. What Montgomery did not know was that Churchill had been struggling with this realization for months. After Patton relieved Bastogne in 72 hours, Churchill had privately noted that Patton accomplished in days what British forces often required weeks to achieve. Watching American units race across France while British advances slowed had deeply unsettled him. Now, standing on a German airfield and watching Montgomery's elaborate preparations finally unfold, Churchill confronted the truth he had long avoided. British military doctrine, which he had defended throughout the war, had been surpassed by American operational speed. Montgomery made one final attempt. If Patton was not disciplined, command authority would lose all meaning. Churchill agreed in principle. Patton had violated protocol. He had ignored coordination requirements. He had embarrassed British leadership. In any properly run military, such behavior would have consequences. But this was not a properly run military. It was a coalition. If Churchill demanded Patton's removal, the Americans would ask why. And Churchill would have to explain that Britain was firing America's most successful general because he moved too quickly without British permission. America supplied the majority of Allied forces. America bore the majority of casualties. America funded the war effort. Their general had crossed the Rhine in a single night with minimal preparation, while Britain required months and enormous resources to do the same. To demand Patton's dismissal would signal that British pride mattered more than Allied victory. As artillery thundered in the distance, Operation Plunder finally began. Montgomery's crossing was underway, precisely executed and meticulously planned. Yet everyone present understood that it was no longer the defining moment of the campaign. The focus had already shifted. Churchill placed a hand on Montgomery's shoulder and acknowledged his achievements. History, he said, would remember Montgomery's victories, but history would also record that an American general crossed the Rhine first. Later that day, Churchill returned to his aircraft without watching the crossing. He sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes before asking his military secretary to take dictation. The message was addressed to Eisenhower. Churchill declined Montgomery's request and recommended that no action be taken against Patton. In a handwritten postscript, he urged Eisenhower to keep Patton moving. That evening, Churchill met privately with his physician. He appeared exhausted. He poured himself a drink and admitted that he had chosen American results over British pride. Montgomery would never forgive him. The military establishment would be furious. But pride, he said, did not win wars. Speed did. When asked whether he regretted the decision, Churchill answered immediately, "Not for a second." Years later, Churchill wrote candidly about the Rhine crossings. Montgomery's operation was a masterpiece of planning. Patton's assault achieved the same objective in a single night with a fraction of the resources. The contrast was painful but instructive. Sometimes leaders must choose between the general who preserves tradition and the general who delivers results. Churchill chose speed. He chose victory. And in doing so, he accepted a truth Britain had been avoiding since 1942. The empire that once defined military excellence was no longer setting the pace of modern warfare. It was struggling